God created a wonderful world and us to rule it, to share in his life, his purposes, and his heart. But we rejected God and embraced evil, ruining the world and enslaving ourselves to death. The rest of the Bible is the account of God reaching out to his ruined world to rescue and restore it. And it all starts with a man called Abraham. God gave Abraham a scary instruction and an amazing promise. He told Abraham to leave his home and set off on a journey to a new life in a new land. He promised to make Abraham's family into a great nation and through them to rescue the whole world from the effect of Adam's sin. Abraham took God at his word and set out in obedience. God had chosen to rule the world through people. Now he would rescue the world through people. Abraham was far from perfect, and God's promise seemed to face insurmountable problems, not least Abraham's and Sarah's infertility. But Abraham held on to the promise and obeyed God. After many years, Abraham miraculously had a son, Isaac. But a few years later, God called him to sacrifice Isaac. Abraham trusted God and set out to obey despite the fact that it seemed to run contrary to the promise. God intervened and provided a ram for the sacrifice. It would cost a son to rescue the world from sin, but God himself would provide that son. Abraham's family was very dysfunctional and faced great obstacles, but every generation hung on to God's promise, and God was faithful to his word through ordinary, broken people in difficult, ambiguous circumstances. Jacob wrestled with God and was given the name Israel, and his sons led the 12 tribes that made up the nation. Genesis closes in Egypt, where the Israelites had taken refuge from a famine with the death of Abraham's great-grandson Joseph. Although they knew God's faithfulness, they all died trusting that God would fulfill his promise beyond their lives. The people were shaped by a promise, which they handed down the generations. The story of Abraham and his family is a picture of what it means to live by faith. We too are given a promise. One day Jesus will return, he'll raise the dead, and he'll throw evil out of God's world. Jesus calls us to live in light of that promise. For us, Abraham is firstly a model of faith. His life was shaped by his confidence in God's promise. He didn't always get it right, but through obedience and experience, he came to trust God with his life, his family, and his death. Secondly, Abraham is a model of obedience. His life was totally changed by God's promise. He left his old life and began a new life in a world that in many ways looked no different. In being willing to sacrifice his son, Abraham touched the heart of God, who went all the way to sacrifice his son for a broken and dying world. To believe God is to trust him and obey him. Finally, Abraham's family is a model of mission. God called Abraham so that through him blessing could flow out to the whole world, undoing the curse that came through Adam's sin. In his death and resurrection, Jesus overcame the power of sin and death. And as his followers, we're to carry God's blessing and healing to the world as we help people to trust and obey Jesus before he returns again to throw sin, evil and death out of the world.